Why do we choose openings? One of the reasons we choose openings is because we want to fight for the center, right? The big key in the opening is let's fight for these 4 squares. And there's 2 main moves in chess for white to start with. One e4 and one d4. And the idea with both of these moves is you start fighting for the center, right? So d4 fights for these squares, you control the d4 square. e4 fights for these squares, you control the e4 square. That's why you don't see moves like pawn to h4 on move 1 very often, because it's not fighting for the center. All right, so curious what you guys like to play. Put in the chat, what's your favorite first move for white, e4 or d4? Or if it's a different move, go ahead and put it. Maybe it's b3, knight f3, c4. What is your favorite first move for white? Wow, a lot of d4s. e4, d4, d4. A ton of d4s. I'm surprised. Usually e4 is quite a bit more common. Okay, great. Mostly e4 and d4. Sometimes swap between them. Yep, sometimes c4. So let's start with talking about e4. e4, right off the bat, starts controlling these light squares in the center. There's 2 main moves for black here, e5 and c5. Both e5 and c5, what they try to do is they try to fight for the dark squares, right? So black controls these squares, white controls these squares. We immediately have a fight for the 4 main central squares. These are the 4 most valuable squares on the board. Now, if we want to take that one step further and say, what are the next most valuable squares? You can probably guess, but it's this group of squares around the center 4 squares. So those are the next most valuable set of squares. So in the opening, your goal is going to be to fight for those center squares. And let me show you an example. If you play something like the modern defense, perfectly reasonable defense, right? This is played at high levels, but you don't tend to see this at the very highest levels with slow time controls. Why is that? White plays d4 on move 2, and after bishop to g7, white can play a move like knight to c3, and look at the center control that white has. White controls d4, e4, d5, and you could argue that the e5 square is attacked once by white and once by black. But the tiebreaker when it comes to controlling squares is, does a pawn attack that square? We have the d4 pawn attacking that square. So if you look at this opening, say black plays d6, white has pretty much full center control to do whatever they want. And look at the eval bar over here, 0.64. Stockfish is aware of this, right? Stockfish knows the space matters. So we want to use our pawns to control space in the center. All right, so against e4, what do you guys play? Let me know in the chat. What's your favorite move to play against e4? I'm guessing we might have a bias towards Caro-Kann's in this chat, but I'm curious to see. All right, e5, Brian. e6, e6 or c5, c6, c6, e5, e6, c5. Okay, a lot of e5s and a lot of Caros, it looks like. Sicilian. Bob says Caro and Sicilian. Brian's starting to roll out the Caro-Kann. Good, good. Okay, so we talked about e5 and c5. Both of these fight for the dark squares. There's a subset of openings that actually play for the light squares. So e4, the downside to this move, if you can call it a downside, this pawn is unprotected, right? d4, that's protected by the queen. So in white's quest to get pawns on e4 and d4, e4 has a slight weakness to it in that it's undefended. So a lot of times what black will do, if they don't play the 2 main moves, fighting for the dark squares, they will play a subset of moves that use a light squared strategy. That's where the Caro-Kann comes in. c6, d4, d5. This already targets the undefended pawn on e4. White needs to make a decision. Do they push past? Do they take? Or do they defend the pawn? Those are the three most common. There's other things too, like fantasy variation, defending the pawn. But White's got to make that decision. Same is true of the Scandinavian defense, which is also called the center counter defense. Black immediately puts that pawn on d5 and starts fighting for the light squares. In French defense, same thing. Light square strategy. So one thing I want you guys to try to work on is see if you can learn each of the major openings in chess and just know a couple ideas behind each opening, right? So let's say I've never played the French defense in my life, but I can tell you a lot of the ideas in the French defense, right? White pushes past. I recognize this pawn chain structure. I know a lot of times White will play, for example, pawn to c3 and get this pawn chain against this. And I can tell you some of the main ideas, like Black wants to strike against this pawn. Black might want to play f6 and strike against this pawn. White wants to put the bishop on d3, bring the knight out, maybe go for a kingside attack, right? So it's good for you guys to figure out not only what the main openings look like in terms of the pawns, but a couple main ideas out of each pawn structure. All right, so we looked at e4. Let's talk a little bit about d4. What do you guys like to play against d4? What's your main defense as Black? Put your main move in the chat or the name of the defense. Classical Dutch. c6, okay. Swap daily, knight f6, d6. Okay, and actually, if you play knight f6 or d5, maybe tell me the name of the defense. Like, do you go for the Slav? Do you go for the King's Indian, the Nimzo? Because probably saying knight f6 or d5 isn't as much detail as I was looking for. Semi-Slav, soon to be Benko. King's Indian, Slav, Nimzo, Queen's Indian. Good to see you, by the way, Dennis. Triangle. Yeah, so a lot of these openings have something in common. Black tends to fight for the light squares. So if you're starting with d5 and you're playing the Slav, which is c6, you're immediately fighting for dark squares. Queen's Gambit declined. Same thing. You're fighting for dark squares. And if you put knight f6 on move 1, sorry, I keep saying dark squares. You're fighting for the light squares. You're fighting for the light squares as Black. You play knight f6 move 1, you're also fighting for light squares. And let's take the Nimzo Indian, for example. Pawn to e6. This doesn't look like it's really fighting for the center control. You're only touching d5, but you're not hitting e4. But the idea is, if White tries to get full control, White wants to play e4 right here, Black needs to fight for that square. And you use the pawns to do that usually, but in this case, you could play bishop to b4, the Nimzo Indian, and then later on you'll play d5 or c5 and try to fight against White's pawn center. So every opening should be based on using your pawns and fighting for the center. All right, let's go now to chapter 2. Next, we are going to talk a little bit about pawn chains and how they relate to space. So someone asked earlier in the chat, are we going to talk about the French defense? Here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the French defense. Pawn to e6, move 1. Okay, now we see d4, d5, e5 by White. So we can already see the pawns are locked up. This is going to dictate the plans in the middle game already. So we're only 3 moves in, but you guys should start to recognize what the plans are for each side. So tell me in the chat, what are the plans for White here? What should White be trying to do just based on this pawn structure? So White's got the dark square control. Black has the light square control. What are the plans for White? It's a harder question. When I ask you guys what's your favorite move in the opening, there's a lot of answers. This is a harder question. Yeah, This is good. So get space, fight for the king side. King side play, attack king side, f4, f5. Pawn chain points towards the king side. Very good. You guys know what's going on here. So after c5, c3, each side develops a little bit. We reach this sort of structure. And what white wants to do, this pawn chain points towards the king side. Black's pawn chain points towards the queen side. So the strategy for white is going to be, let's attack king side. And then there was a good point mentioned by Ufitz. He said, you need to also make sure that this D pawn is secure for white. That's a very important point because this pawn is going to be weak most likely after the pawn trade. It won't be defended by any other white pawns once these C pawns trade off. All right, so now I think this will be an easier question. What's the plan for black? What does black want to do in this position? Looking at this pawn chain on the light squares, locked up with the pawns for white on the dark squares. What is the plan for black here? And PD Wrath makes a good point too. You do want to look at the bishops. So these pawns are working with the bishops, and we're going to get into that next. Plan for black, win the pawn on d4 or play f6. Gain space, fight for the king side. Yeah, so David is correct if we play f6. f6 is going to be the way to fight for the king side. Attack on the queen side, pressure d4. That's good. These are all good answers. So black wants to either pressure d4 or pressure e5 or play on the queen side, right? Like maybe you play queen b6, attack the b pawn. Maybe you expand c4, b5, a5. That's utilizing this pawn chain that points towards white's queen side. So these are all great ideas. All right, let's now jump into chapter 3. This is pawn planning. And we're going to look at some examples of some of my favorite positions in terms of playing based on the pawns. So we're starting 1d4 here. Knight of 6 by black. So this is fighting for the light squares. c4. And white plays c4 here because this is a way to gain control over the d5 square without playing e4. Right? Black already controls e4, so white wants to control d5, and white already controls these. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the game Othello, if you guys have ever played that, where you have the white and black little circles and you flip them over based on captures. You sort of want to control as many squares as possible. So this is what you should be thinking during the opening. Who's controlling which squares? Now c5 by black. This is leading into a Benoni or possibly a Benko structure, and I love these positions. I think they're really rich. The best move for white is to play d5. And the reason for that is white is grabbing extra space. So we see white controls these squares, black controls these squares currently. And now, pawn to b5, this is the Benko gambit. After c takes b, a6, b takes a6, let's just go a little bit deeper and get to the resulting structure. So this is an opening that I've played quite a bit as black, and we do have a Benko gambit course now. We reach this endgame position. So we're 13 moves in. The queens are off the board. White to move. Let me know in the chat. Do you prefer white here, or do you prefer black in this position? What color would you rather play? And this is a little bit different pawn structure than the French. Now we see black has this pawn chain, and white's controlling the light squares with d5 and e4. So last time we looked at black controlling the light squares. Now black controls the dark squares. 3 blacks already, 1 white. Black plans are easier. Black. Yeah, white has no clear targets, you're saying. Black in the queen side pressure. So I agree with you guys. I really like black's position here. And the plans for black, like some of you have already mentioned, are to play queenside. So we can use this pawn structure to figure out the plans. White has two potentially weak pawns on half-open files. This rook pressures the A file. This rook is ready to come over and pressure the B file. So this is a case where black gambited a pawn, and the eval bar is spoiling it, but the eval bar says 0.00. And that's why I'm kind of curious what you guys think, because black is down a pawn, but black also has full compensation for that pawn. And that's when you see the eval 0. If one side is up material, but the eval reflects something different than that material amount, that's when there's compensation. And one thing I will say, for those of you that like to use Stockfish quite a bit to help evaluate positions, I tend to use a rule with the most current versions of Stockfish to cut the eval in half. In this case, it's 0. So 0 divided by 2 is just 0. But if you see an eval of 4, think of it in your mind as a 2-point advantage in terms of material. Because engines are so strong now, I think the evals don't relate as well to us human players. So I like to cut evals in half when you're trying to convert it to material. But in this case, it's equal. Black's plan is to play queenside, very simple. And white's plan is to try to lock up the queenside, so eliminate any weaknesses, and then play kingside. So white would love to play f4, e5, for example. Let's give black a couple bad moves just to see what white can do. The king moves over. Let's guard this pawn first. King moves back. And now knight b5. The reason this is so strong, pawn on a4 and knight on b5, is now there's not a good target on b2 with a rook coming to b8. This knight is going to sit here for a long time. This buys white time to go for the f4 plan. It takes a little bit of shuffling. This knight has to move, but then the idea is let's go pawn to f4, pawn to e5, and let's try to crash through, because eventually this knight is probably going to move, and then white can go for the plan, like maybe bishop c3, and try to get this central break in while stopping these pawns from becoming weak. Okay, so we know black's plan here, I think. We'll just talk about it briefly. Let's say white goes knight e1, something kind of slow. He can go rook to b8, pressuring the b2 pawn. Now let's say white plays rook to b1 to defend it. Now knight to d7 is a good move. And this knight is shifting over to the queen side, and we're opening up the bishop on the diagonal. This rook is already pointing here. So let's say white gets a little greedy, goes right for their center push. We could check first. Now this king is lacking king safety a little bit, right? So that could lead to tactical problems later on. But now you can play a move like bishop takes c3 even. And after bishop takes back, knight to b4. And even though black is trading when they're down a pawn, this pressure is coming very quick. And you can see the eval bar, it's actually black that has a 1.5 Stockfish advantage. And thinking about it in terms of material, that might be like 3/4 of a pawn that black is up, even though they're down one pawn. Okay, so that's the Benko. Now let's go back to this position after 3d5, and let's look at 3e6. This opening is called the Benoni. Knight to c3, takes, and now we're getting a little bit different pawn structure, right? Black just lost the e pawn, white lost the c pawn. We'll go a bit deeper into this opening, and we'll stop right here. So the eval is 0.3. The Benoni is an opening that Stockfish tends to like a little bit better for white. It's not terrible for black, but definitely there's a preference for white according to the engine. Let me know here, what is the best move for black? What do you think the best move for black is? And this is a very important move for black to find. We're still in opening theory. Type your answers in the chat. Best move for black. Couple b5s, couple a6. King, knight to d7. Rook e8. Knight d7. Knight d7. So I think you guys are on the right track. These are all moves that we would like to play. So based on this pawn structure, black has control of these two dark squares, white has control of these two light squares, but there's no pawn on c4, right? No pawn here. The best strategy for black is to take the direction this pawn chain points and play for b5. And in this case, b5 works tactically, and it's the only good move for black. So let's say black plays knight b to d7. The problem now is white can play a4, and your main plan as black, playing b5, is going to be forever shut down. And this is already a 0.9 eval for white. So b5 is the best move. After knight takes b5, rook e8, castles, knight takes e4. This works out tactically, and now you get a position that looks a little bit like the Benko, right? And this is something, again, where you can draw on your knowledge of other openings and other pawn structures to dictate your plans. So we already kind of talked about what to do in the Benko. We have a lot of similarities here. White's going to want to play on the king side, and in this case, attack the pawn on d6. It's the weakest black pawn on the board. Black is going to want to play on the queen side and attack this pawn on b2. That's going to be the weak pawn target. Now, let's look at one more Benoni style opening. Pawn to c5 by black on move 1. I love this pawn structure a lot, and a fun fact, this opening is one of the best scoring openings for black in Blitz, and it's even true at high levels. And I'll show you the reason why. It's because it's so easy to play for black. So we have c5 and e5. Black is going for control of the dark squares. White most likely will play e4 and c4. So we see classic dark square versus light square battle. This is a V formation. And I find the V pawn formations very fascinating, right? So black has this backward pawn on d6, meaning there's no pawns beside it or next to it on the adjacent files. But that pawn anchors the V formation going both directions. V for vendetta. So the plans for black are, let's look for pawn pushes outside of the V formation. Let's target the base of white's pawn chains, because maybe we can make those pawns weak, right? So picture both B pawns being off the board. C4 could become a big weakness. Let's picture both F pawns off the board. E4 could become a big weakness. So based on this pawn structure, you would think white needs to target d6, but that's not easy to do. The whole center is closed up. So let's go forward a few moves, and then we'll talk about the plans a bit. Bishop e7, knight c3, g3, bishop g2. We reach this position. The eval is +1, by the way. So in practice, black does really well on these positions. Stockfish is saying, I prefer white though. So let me know, what do you think the best plans are for black in this position? We got the V formation. All of these pieces are a little bit cramped back here, sitting on the 7th and 8th ranks. What are the best plans for black? Type your answers in the chat. Yeah, we're getting some good answers. Reg Dog, I think you're ready for the question, what to do as white. Good, good. So we're seeing F5 expansion. That's exactly right. We want to trade off, either just eliminate the E pawn completely or trade off the F pawns to weaken the E pawn. And then the other answer is bishop to g5. In this position, it doesn't work as well because white's ready to play f4 in response. But this is a common strategy. If you can trade off these dark square bishops, like let's just say white takes, queen takes g5, now you're left with a bishop that works with these pawns. You want your bishop to be the opposite color of your pawns. That's almost always true. It's counterintuitive at first because we think we would want the bishop to be the same color as our pawns so that we can defend them. But that's not true. You want to play dynamic chess. You want to control as many squares as possible. So just like pawns control squares, so do bishops. You want your bishops to be opposite color of your pawns. That's almost always true. So black gets rid of the bishop that's on the color of their pawns. White loses the bishop that's opposite their pawns. So this trade, c1 bishop for the one on e7, that's a strategic win for black. Now, the computer does still say white has a small advantage because it can look deeper, but that cut into white's advantage quite a bit. f5, another great plan. And if black could play b5, that would be a good plan too. Like you could play a6 here, and maybe rook b8, b5. So you want to use that V formation just like the pawn chains we saw in the French, and you want to push your pawns outside of the V and attack white's pawn chains. Even in the endgames, you tend to want your bishop opposite color of your pawns and just make sure your pawns are defended. All right, so now let's talk about what are the plans for white. I think it's a little harder to figure out the plans for white in this type of structure because, normally when we looked at like the French defense, the pawn chain pointed like this. It was very clear. White just wants to attack kingside. That's where all the pawns point. Well, what do we do here? Our pawn chains just stop. They stop at d5. So we don't have that real healthy pawn chain running all the way to the king side or all the way to the queen side. So type in the chat, what are the plans for white in this position? Regdog, I already had an answer earlier. a3, b4. That's one idea. f4 to open it up. Refer to the earlier comment, exactly. What other plans should white be going for? Or are those the only two? Okay, I might have stumped you guys a little bit. So a3, b4 is a good plan if you have time to do it. f4 is probably the best plan. Then the third thing that I would say is knowing that you can play f4 no matter what, you can try to shut down black's plan on the queen side. So you can take a moment to play a move like a4, even if you don't see a6. You can play a4, shut down this queen side play, and when black plays f5, you're going to be ready to meet it with f4. And the idea here is once these pawns all trade off, now this pawn that's sitting on d6 is going to become a huge weakness for black. So just like RHUK is saying, you can start to reroute the pieces now to target that pawn on d6. Like let's say f takes e, knight takes e, e takes f, knight takes f. It's already apparent that's probably the weakest pawn on the whole board. And going back to our very first chapter of this lecture, who has more space? White. The pawns, c4 and d5, against the pawns on c5 and d6, determine which side has more space. White has more space here. Black has the weakest pawn on the board, most likely, the pawn on d6. And the eval reflects that, 1.6 for white. This is a big advantage. Black does have this nice outpost on e5. Can easily be defended though. The pawn on c4 can easily be defended by b3. Now, white's weakest pawn should be the pawn on b3. How is black ever really putting pressure on that b3 pawn? It's not going to be easy. And all of these pieces for black are still jumbled up in the back 2 ranks. Only the e5 knight is strong. So big advantage for white. And this is based on the pawn structure, right? We're using pawns to play for that advantage. And just like going back to that Benoni position, if black doesn't play b5 here, if they play knight d7 and rook e8, this is already a bad structure for black because they are never getting their queenside push in, and white has all the space, which is based on the pawns. So this is why pawns are so important. You get this sort of position as white, where the computer says you're +1, or that position we just looked at where the computer said you're +1.6, like this position. If you're playing an opponent that's your level, you know, maybe plus or minus a couple hundred points, you want to get these +1 positions because it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to play. There's going to be way more chances for them to make mistakes that you can convert. Whereas if you make a mistake and you started +1, +1.5, you might still be +0.5, right? You got extra leeway. So we're using pawns to create that space and to create those advantages. All right, next, we're going into IQPs, and we're going to look at the Caro-Kann. The Caro-Kann has a lot of different pawn structures that can come out of it. That's one thing I like quite a bit about the Caro. This is called the Panov attack. So, sorry, I went a little bit fast. White trades on d5, plays c4. This is called the Panov. And in this position, let's take a quick moment to talk about pawn tension. And there is a really good video on our YouTube channel by Smithy Q where he talks about pawn tension. Pawn tension is when 2 pawns attack each other, and each side needs to determine, what do I do about that tension? Do I relieve the tension? And that's either by trading or pushing a pawn, or do I keep the tension and do something else? One thing that you'll tend to find is most club level players do not like tension. Pawn tension is confusing and people can't figure out what to do. And you'll especially notice this in Blitz and Bullet. People will just trade these pawns or push because they feel uncomfortable with tension. But really, both sides should have that feeling of just a little on edge, right? Like your adrenaline's going a bit. These pawns are locked up. They're attacking each other. What do I do with those pawns? With this pawn tension, let me know in the chat, does this pawn tension favor white or does it favor black? So write white or black in the chat, and then I'll explain what I mean by favor, and we'll talk a little bit about it. Does this pawn tension favor white or black? Most people are saying white. I see 1 black. And I think if your answer is black, you might be Wayne might be thinking about the IQP, resulting IQP position. White. Right, so I agree that it's white. And the reason is exactly what Bill says. If black takes, it improves white's position. There's not only bishop takes c4 here, but there might be a real quick d5. So black does not want to take. So the 2 options for black are to sit still and to take. And this is going to Ethan's point. Black has 2 options for that pawn. White has 3 options. This pawn can sit still, it can take, or it can push. And from white's point of view, they're all decent options. Sitting still is probably the best. Maybe pushing, they're kind of tied. And capturing, even though it's not great in terms of maximizing your chance for an advantage, it's not bad either, right? So black's only option that was good was to just sit still. white has two good options, sit and push, and an okay option to take. So that's a quick little aside on pawn tension. When you have pawn tension that favors you, don't be so quick to relieve that pawn tension until you can convert it into something better. Keep that pawn tension and make your opponent uncomfortable. All right, so this comes out of our Caro-Kann course. We recommend move 6, A6, and it's a tricky move. What we're doing is we're essentially saying we're going to keep this pawn tension, wait for your bishop to move off of F1, because once this bishop moves, let's say bishop E2, now it's actually a good decision for black to relieve the tension, because after white takes back, we gain a tempo on the bishop. And all of a sudden, we're getting real quick development. You could play E6 here. You could play bishop G4 and then E6. And black is controlling the dark squares. Black controls the light squares. White controls the dark squares. And we have a pretty equal position where we're getting this classic IQP fight in the center. A6 isn't necessarily like the Shebenenko Slav, but a little bit. I think the main point of A6 is we know that this is going to be a good move anyways. We're going to tend to want to play B5, and it's making white figure out what do they do with that bishop. So now, let's say white plays pawn to B3. You can see that eval bar just dropped a little bit. But what would you play here as black? Let me know in the chat, what move would you play here as black? So this isn't a great move for white, but it's kind of a hard one to figure out because look what white's doing. White's creating this pawn chain. And now if we capture, white has the option of capturing back with a pawn and taking quite a bit of center control. So what do you play as black here? Bishop G5, I see. I'm assuming that's bishop to G4 because we're looking from black side. G6, B5. Couple G6s. And G6 is the idea that we use in the Caro-Kann course quite a bit. Take the pawn. White could play D5 here, but I know what you're getting at, David, and we're going to talk about that, the hanging pawn structure. So the top move is probably bishop to G4. Get that bishop outside of the pawn chain and then play E6. But there's a move that I like here even better, and it's trying to take advantage of these dark squares. So every time you push a pawn, it creates some weaknesses behind where that pawn was, right? The pawn was on B2. Now it's on B3. So white's doing a nice job with these light squares, but what about the resulting dark squares? The pawn on B2 used to guard A3 and C3. What move could black play here to take advantage of that? No one's mentioned it yet, so give me a move for black to take advantage of these dark squares. I'm pretty sure you'll get it. You have to think dynamic chess. Okay, 3 E6s, a knight to B4. If you have our dynamic Slav course, think of the Slav exchange chapter and what move do we play quite a bit. Couple queen A5s. You guys are on the right track. One person did get the solution. Lucas got the answer. It's pawn to E5. This move looks crazy. But I want you guys to find these sort of moves in your games too. You want to think about not only the pawn structure, but which squares and which color complexes are weakened based on your opponent's pawns. So sometimes this burns me in games. I'll wait for my opponents to overextend their pawns, and then I'll look at what weaknesses the pawns create. This is something that works for me quite well, so I've trained myself to do this, right? Let the opponents play moves like b3 and then try to fight against it, fight against their weaknesses. Sometimes it burns me though, because I wait forever as a counterattacker and my opponent doesn't create those weaknesses, and then before I know it, I'm just in a really bad position. But this move e5, I think, is the best practical move on the board. If d takes e, the natural move, it looks like white just won a free pawn and they're on our knight. But we can play bishop to b4, taking advantage immediately of the fact that this pawn moved up to b3. We hit the loose knight, which is pinned to the king. And if white, for example, plays pawn takes knight, we have bishop takes c3, checking the king and the rook in the corner. Black is winning. If white plays bishop to d2, the best move on the board, now there's one move for black that holds a slight advantage. Pawn to d4. What is this doing? Dark squares, taking advantage of the dark squares. If pawn takes knight, another blunder. Now we have d takes c3, hitting the bishop, which would come with check. So there's not really time to play a3. We take the bishop with check. And if the bishop moves, this is even worse. c2 is check, and it hits the queen. That's GG, game over. So we're playing fighting chess here. We're thinking about the color complexes. I want you guys to do this in your games. All right, one more line to look at, and then we'll go to the next chapter. So now let's look at c takes d5, knight takes, bishop c4, e6. This is a traditional IQP, which stands for isolated queen pawn. It's an IQP position. What are the plans for each side? So maybe put like a W, and then the plans for white, and then a B, and then the plans for black. What are your plans for each side in this position? Classic IQP. Put your plans in the chat. Okay, black wants to blockade the pawn, trade down pieces, and win the pawn. Black, trade minor pieces, maybe a rook, keep the queen and pressure the IQP for a nice endgame. Yeah, you guys are on the right track. White, push your IQP. And sometimes you can use that to tactically create advantages. Black exchange, white use the space and attack. Push the IQP. Take on d5, give black an IQP. Yep, that's an option. White play dynamically, kingside, or push the pawn. So it sounds like you guys have some good knowledge of IQPs. You're all on the right track. White wants to play dynamically, play to attack, push this pawn at the right time, but also attack the king side. That's pretty common. Like maybe the knight plants on e5, the bishop comes back to this diagonal. White wants to attack king side. So now I'm curious, let me know, this position has an eval of 0.2. So it's essentially the same eval that the game starts with, just a very small advantage for white. Do you guys prefer white or black in this position? Just type white or black, W or B. Which color would you rather play here? Because I tend to find that the computers feel the IQP is about equal, or maybe they even favor the side with the IQP in general, if there's enough dynamic play. But in human versus human play, I find that a lot of players like to play against the IQP because they know they can just sort of trade down and their plans are a little bit more obvious. Whereas I think white has just a little bit more pressure to try to prove the compensation for the weak pawn. Okay, pretty even actually in the chat. Some people are saying it's hard to defend the IQP. Others are saying, no, white's just got to lead in development. I agree with Isaac. IQP can be hard to prove for a human. Yep. All right, so now let's just go a little bit deeper and show what could happen. Bishop reroutes to d3, points at h7. This is kind of your typical development process for each side. You can see what they're doing. Black now has pawn, knight, queen, and bishop, all controlling that d5 square. So black has overprotection of d5. Black does not want that pawn to dynamically push at a moment that's good for white. White, though, has this queen-bishop battery pointing at h7. They have the bishop on g5 attacking the defender of h7. They have the rook on e1 attacking the pawn on e6. This knight is almost for sure going to e5, which pressures this pawn in the chain f7, e6. So white is shifting all of their forces to point over at black's king, and black is shifting all their forces to block the e pawn. So this is kind of your traditional IQP play. And I should mention in this position, the ChessGoals move is bishop to e6. And what I like about this one is it's more dynamic. And we're going to get into essentially this exact structure in the next chapter. We got the bishops lined up. All right, so Caro-Kann, Panov, 6a6, get the trade, bishop e6, bishop to b3. The reason for bishop to b3 is if white castles, knight takes c3, hits the queen, hits the bishop. Common mistake you'll see at the club level, especially in faster games like Blitz. Black is already completely winning. So this comes out of the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course, this bishop e6 move and the idea of this tactic. But let's give white a good move. Bishop b3. And now I want to look at this pawn structure. We take on c3 as black. White takes back. This is called hanging pawns. So hanging pawns are when one side has two pawns adjacent to each other. The opposing color does not have pawns on those files. And then you'll tend to see the opposite is true, where the side with the hanging pawns doesn't have pawns on either side. And the side fighting against the hanging pawns has pawns on the two adjacent files. So you get this sort of classic hanging pawn look with these two pawns fighting against the two adjacent pawns. So in this position, bishop to d5 is not a great move, but I'm showing this as an example. Let's swap off these bishops, play e6. The eval here is around 0.2, so very similar to the start of the game. David, this is a great question. Which side do you guys prefer here? Do you prefer white or black in this position? It's a 0.2, so it's not a trick question. It's a preference question. Do you prefer white or black here? David says black. He's thinking that these pawns are going to become a weakness. It's interesting, the players who like the IQP, I think will tend to like the hanging pawns because the hanging pawns do give more center control, just like Bill is saying. Ethan and Dennis say black. RHUK is saying white again. Yeah, it's very interesting. So if you're an attacking player, if you tend to like to attack, you're probably more likely to pick white here. If you tend to be more of a solid player, strategic, a tactical player tend to like white, strategic player tend to like black. White is missing the light square bishop. You're right, Dennis. So this position is about equal. But let's see what each side wants to do. If black is able to permanently blockade this pawn, it's going to be a big advantage for black. So let's say rook e1 is played, pawn to b5. Let's give white bishop to f4. We'll get black castled. Let's say queen d2. Knight to a5. If black can create this sort of setup where these pawns are forever stuck and one pawn is pushed ahead of the other pawn, that's when black can fight against the opposite color complex. So look at all of these pawns on light squares. The queen controls light squares. The knight is controlling c4. White is in big trouble here. The eval is only minus 0.5, but I really don't picture white ever winning this position. The hanging pawns are stuck, one's in front of the other, and all black has to do is keep piling up all the forces on those pawns. White doesn't have much going for them in this position. But now, let's look at a different version. Let's say here, bishop takes b3 is played. Ignore the moves a little bit. I'm just trying to get to the resulting position. White has pawns on c4 and d4. The last move for black is a bit of a mistake. Rook to b8, trying to guard this weak pawn. I already showed the move by accident, but tell me in the chat, what's the best move for white here? Maybe you missed it. What is the best move for white? There's one move that's completely winning, +4. Everything else is +1 or less for white. We got these two healthy hanging pawns and they're connected. That's what you want. You want the pawns connected. And then this is a really common plan when you have the hanging pawns. First, white applied pressure outside of the hanging pawns, like some people mentioned earlier. Attack the b pawn. Yep, you guys are right. Pawn to d5, that's the move for white. d5, black is in huge trouble here. It came at the perfect time. Hits this knight. Let's say e takes d, c takes d. This knight has to retreat. White is all over black's position. This is not going to be fun. And even though black can get castled, look at these pieces. Everything is on the optimal square. This is a passed pawn. Look at the black pieces. All stuck back here trying to defend. Everything's on the last two ranks. This is already +6. It's tactically going to be lost for black. It's losing material by force. Queen a5 falls for the fork. Queen d6 falls for the skewer. And I shouldn't even say falls for, like there's no way out for black. So that's kind of a brief overview of hanging pawns, good version and a bad version. Now we're moving on to the Carlsbad structure. This lecture is going to go a little bit over an hour, but that's okay. So we're going to look at this out of a Caro-Kann defense again. Exchange variation this time. So no c4 by white. That's the Panov. This is going to be the exchange variation. White puts their pawns on this pawn chain. And as we're going to see, black will eventually have pawns on the light squares. So that typical light versus dark battle in the center. This is our ChessGoals move. We prevent the bishop from coming out here easily. So this pawn structure comes out of a lot of openings where you see one side has the 4 queenside pawns, the separation on the E file in this case. Having trouble drawing an arrow. There we go. And then the other side has 2 queenside pawns and 5 sort of kingside / center with this separation. This is the Carlsbad structure. It comes out of a ton of different openings. Caro-Kann exchange is a common one. Also, the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation can come out of that as well with the colors reversed. What are the plans for each side here? Let me know. What does white want to do here and what does black want to do here? So put W, plan for white, B, plan for black. This is a classic Carlsbad. Black minority attack. PD Wrath, you're on top of it today. Or center play. So we're seeing minority attack for black. Possible center play. Prevent that knight on F3 from getting into the game. White attack kingside. Exchange the dark square bishops. Yep, that's good. So this is the good bishop for black. Opposite color of the pawn chain. White kingside attack. Don't we like f3 in the course? Yep, in this case f6. But in our Queen's Gambit course, color is reversed. We do play f3 as white with the same structure that black has here. Potentially opposite side castling. That's an option. I don't tend to recommend it, but that is an option. You guys are spot on here. So rook e1, knight f6. Let's look at sort of the classic kingside versus queenside play. Castle. Put a rook on b8, trying to play b5. This is sort of your classic setup. I found an example where the eval is 0.00. So let me know in the chat, which color do you prefer here? And I think, again, we're going to see the strategic players are going to pick black. The attacking, tactical players are going to pick white. Who do you prefer here, white or black? We got a 0.00 eval. Couple whites, black. Black, it's 2-2. Black, 3-2. Both. I like both. Just means you have an appreciation of both sides. Bill, I was guessing you would say white. Dennis, white. David's not sure. Okay, RHUK says this time black, usually white. Yeah, so we have an interesting dynamic position here where essentially both sides are getting exactly what they want, and neither side has tried to slow down the opponent's plan. One move that black could play here to try to slow down white's plan is pawn to f5 in the right position. Like, let's say white sticks a knight here. Now we see the bishop hitting h7, the knight pressuring this pawn, rook on this pawn. There's a lot of white pieces around the black king. f5 could be a move to try to slow down white's kingside play. This is not a bad idea for black. Even though you do create this potentially weak pawn on e6, that can slow down the attack, and you still have your minority attack on the queen side. And a plan for white to slow this down we'll actually look at next. This is something that actually I had to learn the hard way. I was already rated probably 2000 or 2100, and I can remember my opponent. His name was Reed. He was a friend of mine. I remember the game even. Had that much of an influence on me. I was playing this classic Caro-Kann minority attack, and this isn't the exact game, but I was able to recreate the idea at least. So black's going for minority attack here. What move should white play in this position? Let me know in the chat. What's the best move for white? This is a way to play it against the minority attack directly. White is not necessarily playing on the king side here. You can play on the queen side. A3, B4. Those are the answers I'm seeing so far. A4, B4, A3, A3, A4. So let's look at A3. A3 is okay. White's still doing a little bit better, but it's not the idea in the position. The idea is you want to play A4 and B4 in either order. I think B4, though, highlights a little more clearly my idea. Look at this white kind of V formation with the pawns, controlling the dark squares. Black is controlling the light squares. So we've seen this before, but white has a plan here. Let's say black castles. White can play A4. And the tables have completely turned on black. This minority attack, which was supposed to be black's way to push for their advantage, their strategic advantage, has completely backfired. Now the weakest pawn on the board is going to be this pawn on b5. So let's just give black a move. H6, let's say rook b8. Just for example, White could play A takes B, move the bishop. This is already 0.5 or 0.6 advantage for white. This pawn is not easily going to be attacked. This pawn is the weakest pawn on the board. Queen and bishop are lined up, and white's coming down the A file. And if we go back a couple moves, we've talked about this pawn tension before. I actually wouldn't capture this pawn right away. Leave this pawn tension as white, because black does not want to trade these pawns. So here you could play a move like bishop d2 and just make your opponent squirm a little bit. Make black figure out, what do they do in this position? Black is just sitting and waiting with that pawn tension, a4 and b5, and they can't figure out what to do. White's able to just build the pressure, build the pressure. This is a 0.9 advantage. One of the best moves for black here is knight a7. This is pure defense. Black is just trying to figure out, how do I hold this queen side? Maybe they'll play knight b5, but this is purely a defensive move. Black would love to draw this position. This is not going to be good for black. So that's an example of a minority attack gone wrong for black. This is one of my favorite ways to fight against the minority attack. And if you can picture a position, let's just see if I can set it up randomly. Ignore the bad moves. If you can picture a position where this knight plants in here and this pawn gets to a4, this is like a really terrible example. If you get some sort of position like this, where the knight hops into c5 with this pawn structure already figured out, even better for white. So sometimes you can create a position where you know you have a Carlsbad, you see your opponent's got the minority attack coming, and you know you're going to do this setup, this V-shaped pawn setup. If you can also plant a knight on c5 after these pawns are already set, you're in extremely good shape. This is 1.7 or 1.8 eval. The game in practice is essentially over for black. This is really bad. Okay, now let's talk about one more plan for black. So that was really dismal looking for black. This is what we tend to do in the ChessGoals Carol concourse. Instead of knight f6, we play knight g to e7. This is something that I didn't appreciate much when I used to play the Carol Con. I would only go for the minority attack. But I think that chess engines are starting to show, and top GMs now follow this advice, that with the Carlsbad structure, the side with the two queenside pawns, the traditional minority attack side, engines are starting to show that that side should actually break in the center. It tends to be stronger. So the way to do that is to look to play f6 and e5. Even though you had this nice, pretty pawn chain, real solid, you're actually going to go for e5. And this is a move that I struggle to still play to this day. I'm going to have a video coming out eventually on always play f6, because in this sort of structure, you really want to play f6 and e5. If you get this position as black, now who's controlling the center? Black already has this pawn and this square, and black is equally fighting for the dark squares. Black controls the center. Yeah, don't listen to Ben Feingold. Never play f3. Always play f3. Always play f6. I will say, like, you got to be careful with these squares open around your king, but positionally, this is definitely the strongest way to play this for black. If white takes, hanging pawn structure, the pawns are next to each other. This position is equal according to the engine, but in practice, black does really well here. e4 is coming. Black's pointing kingside. Black's pieces are all pretty well placed. White's are just a little bit more passive. What white wants to do to fight against this structure, they want to play c4 at some point. So let's say you have this position and it's white to move. This could be a good moment. Well, I left the pawn hanging on e6, didn't I? this could be a good moment to play a move like c4. Because this sort of structure, IQP, against a weak pawn on e6, also gives black some dynamic play. This is about balanced. So that's kind of the super high level Carlsbad structure overview. Yeah, chess simple. That's exactly right. Let me just show that. This can come out of Queen's Gambit declined. The side that we just looked at playing black is now playing white. So here you could play, let's say bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, c6, bishop d3, castle. Does this look familiar? Knight e2. So here you had knight f3 or knight e2. f3. And we do have, ChessGoals has a formerly called the classical 1d4 course. Now it's called the Queen's Gambit course. But we recommend this exact strategy. Carlsbad structure, we try to play e4 as white. Regdog, good question. Which is easier for the human, f6 or minority? I think for beginners, minority. For players over, let's say, 2,000, the f6 plan. And at the club level, about equal. But I think it's good to really learn how to play the f6 plan, or in this case, the f3 plan, because this will help you grow as a chess player. And as your rating gets higher, people know how to fight against the minority attack, and it's not as effective as the f6, e5, or the f3, e4 plan. So, great question.